Imagine falling asleep every single night in 40 pounds of metal, leather, and iron. Not because you wanted to, not because you were lazy or forgot to take it off, but because the moment you closed your eyes without it, you were already dead. Over 1,000 years, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and every single one of them followed the same brutal, unforgiving rule. A rule so demanding, so physically punishing, that modern military trainers still struggle to replicate it. A rule that turned ordinary farmers and tradesmen into the most feared fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. And it all came down to one terrifying question that every Roman soldier faced every single night. What happens if they come while I'm sleeping? Here's what most people don't understand about the Roman Empire. It wasn't just big. It was impossibly big. At its height, Rome controlled over 5 million square kilometers of territory. From the scorching deserts of North Africa to the frozen, fog-covered forests of northern Britain. From the sun-baked shores of the Middle East to the wild, unpredictable banks of the Rhine and the Danube. And every single inch of that border had something on the other side of it. Something that wanted in. Germanic tribes, Dacian warriors, Parthian cavalry, Pictish raiders. These were not disorganized mobs of angry farmers waving sticks. Many of them were seasoned, vicious, tactically intelligent fighters who had spent generations learning one very specific skill: how to hurt Romans. And their favorite method? The night raid. Strike fast. Strike hard. Vanish before dawn. It sounds simple, but in practice, a well-executed night raid against an unprepared Roman camp could be catastrophic. Hundreds of soldiers dead before they even reached their weapons. Supply lines destroyed. Morale shattered. And the message sent to every barbarian tribe within 100 miles: the Romans can be broken. But here's the thing. The Romans knew this. They had known it for centuries. And so they built a system. A system so thorough, so psychologically demanding, so physically extreme, that it effectively turned every Roman soldier into a weapon, even in his sleep. The question is, how did it actually work? Let's start from the very beginning. From the moment a young man signed his name, or pressed his mark, into the Roman military rolls. The average recruit was between 17 and 22 years old. He came from a farm, a market town, a fishing village. He had probably never traveled more than 30 miles from where he was born. He had definitely never held a gladius, never marched 20 miles in a single day, never slept on frozen ground with rain hammering a leather tent above his head. He was, in every meaningful sense, completely unprepared for what was about to happen to him. The first thing the Roman army did was take everything away from him. His old clothes, his old shoes, his old name, effectively. From now on, he was not a person. He was a miles, a soldier, a unit, a function, and his function had a very specific set of physical requirements. The larica segmentata, the iconic segmented plate armor, weighed somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds on its own. Add the helmet, the scutum shield, the gladius, the pilum javelins, the pack containing rations, tools, personal equipment, and a marching soldier was regularly carrying between 40 and 60 pounds of total load. Every single day, for years. The training regimen was, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible. New recruits marched 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, 3 times per month. Not on flat roads, over hills, through mud, in summer heat and winter frost. They swam rivers. They climbed walls. They dug trenches. They built camps from scratch and tore them down again before sunrise. But here's the detail that almost nobody talks about. They did much of this in armor. Not all of it. Not always. But enough. Enough that wearing armor stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like a second skin. Enough that the weight stopped registering as weight and became simply presence. The presence of being a soldier. This was not an accident. This was engineering. The Roman military understood something that almost no other fighting force in the ancient world had fully grasped. The biggest vulnerability of any army wasn't its weapons or its numbers or even its tactics. It was the gap between sleeping and fighting. That gap, those precious, terrifying seconds between waking up and being ready to kill, that was where soldiers died. That was where battles were lost. That was where empires crumbled. and the Romans were determined to close it. Now let's talk about the camps themselves, because the camps are where this whole system comes to life. A Roman marching camp, the castra, was not a loose collection of tents thrown up wherever soldiers happened to stop. It was a fortress, built fresh every single day. Every single day, when a Roman legion stopped to make camp, soldiers who had just marched 18 miles in full equipment immediately picked up their entrenching tools and went to work. They dug a ditch, the fossa, typically 3 to 5 feet deep and 4 to 5 feet wide, running the entire perimeter of the camp. Behind the ditch, they built a rampart from the excavated earth, reinforced with wooden stakes that each soldier carried as part of his personal marching kit. On top of the rampart, a palisade of sharpened stakes. The whole structure, for a standard legion of 5,000 men plus auxiliaries, could cover 30 to 60 acres. And they built it in roughly 2 to 3 hours. Not because they were superhuman, but because they had done it hundreds of times. Because every man knew his role, his position, his exact task. Because the system removed individual decision-making and replaced it with automatic, instinctive execution. Inside the camp, the layout was always identical. The Via Principalis ran east to west through the center. The Via Praetoria ran north to south. The commander's tent, the Praetorium, sat at the intersection. Every unit knew where it was quartered relative to those roads. Every soldier could find his position in total darkness. This was the point. In a night attack, there is no time to think. There is no time to orient yourself, to ask a comrade where the east gate is, to figure out which direction the enemy is coming from. You need to move on pure muscle memory. And the camps were designed to make that possible. But the camp itself was only half the system. The other half lived inside the tent. 8 men shared a single leather tent, a contubernium. These 8 men were not just tent mates. They were a unit in every sense. They trained together. They marched together. They ate together. They depended on each other for survival in a way that went far beyond friendship or loyalty. If one man failed, all 8 could die. And in that tent, every single night, a very specific routine played out. Armor did not come fully off. This is the part that sounds like myth, but is documented in Roman military manuals, in the writings of Vigilius, in archaeological evidence from camps along the Rhine and the Danube frontiers. The degree to which armor was removed depended on the threat level of the region, the orders of the commanding officer, and the current state of alert. In active frontier zones, the places where barbarian raids were not a distant possibility, but a nightly reality, soldiers were expected to sleep in a state of immediate readiness. What did that mean in practice? Greaves, the leg armor, were typically removed. They were the most awkward to sleep in and the quickest to put back on. The helmet was usually set within arm's reach, not worn but accessible in seconds. But the larica, the body armor, in high-threat situations, stayed on, or was loosened but not removed, kept over the torso so that standing up meant being largely protected. The gladius was never more than a hand's length away. Some accounts suggest soldiers slept with the blade physically within their grip. Imagine that for a moment. Not just sleeping with a weapon nearby, sleeping holding a weapon, night after night, week after week, month after month. The physical toll of this was enormous. Armor chafes. It shifts. The metal holds cold in winter and traps heat in summer. The leather straps create pressure points that bloom into raw, bleeding sores if not carefully managed. The weight on the chest can restrict breathing, creating a shallow, restless sleep that leaves a man perpetually exhausted. And yet, when you compare that exhaustion to the alternative, waking up to a Dacian warrior standing over you with a falx, the math becomes very simple. Now let's talk about the watch system, because this is where the Roman military genius really shows itself. The night was divided into 4 watches, the vigilia. Each watch lasted approximately 3 hours, calculated by a water clock, the clepsydra, kept at the Praetorium. Every unit rotated through watch duty. Every soldier, regardless of rank, understood that he would stand watch approximately once every 4 nights. This was not optional. This was not subject to personal preference or mood. And the watch was not passive. Roman sentries did not stand in one place, staring into the darkness. They patrolled. They moved in defined patterns along the ramparts and through the camp's interior. They checked the gates. They watched the approaches. They listened. And in the ancient world, in a silent night far from any city, the sounds of a forest or a plain could carry an enormous amount of information. The snap of a twig 200 meters away, the splash of men crossing a shallow river, the nervous shuffling of horses. The sentries communicated through a password system. The tessera, a small wooden or clay tablet passed from the commander's tent to each watch unit each evening. The password changed every night. If a man on patrol challenged you and you couldn't produce the correct word, the consequences were immediate and severe. But here's what made the watch system truly brilliant. The officer responsible for checking the watches, typically a senior non-commissioned officer, made his rounds unpredictably, not at set times, not in a predictable pattern. He appeared without warning, checked that every sentry was awake and in position, and recorded the results on the tessera tablet. A sentry found asleep on watch faced punishment so severe it serves as its own warning. The fustuarium, the other soldiers in his unit, his contubernium, the men who depended on him, were given rods and stones. And they beat him, sometimes to death, not out of cruelty, though that was certainly present, out of necessity, because a sleeping sentry was not just a lazy soldier. He was an open door. He was the crack through which everything the Romans had built could come pouring in. Let me stop here for a moment and make you feel what this was actually like. You are 19 years old. You grew up on a farm in central Italy. The most violent thing you had ever seen before enlisting was a pig being slaughtered. Now you are in a leather tent on the German frontier. It is the middle of winter. The temperature is well below freezing. The ground beneath your bedroll is iron hard. Your armor is cold against your skin, not cool, cold, the way metal gets when the air itself seems to be made of ice. You can't fully sleep. Not really. The armor prevents it. Your body has learned over months of service that full, deep sleep is a luxury you are not allowed. You drift in and out of something that is technically rest, but feels more like waiting. Outside, you can hear the forest. And the forest is never fully silent. There are sounds out there that you have learned to categorize. Wind in the branches, fine. An owl, fine. The creak of the wooden palisade contracting in the cold, fine. But there are other sounds. Sounds that don't belong. Sounds that make the hair on your arms lift even under the weight of the larica. Your hand tightens on the grip of your gladius. Every man in the tent with you is in the same state. Not one of you is fully asleep. Not tonight. Not on this stretch of the frontier, where 3 weeks ago a sentry from the next camp along the river was hit at the second hour of night and lost 11 men before the alarm was raised. 11 men. In minutes. Because they were sleeping. You are not going to be sleeping. The psychological dimension of this system is something that rarely gets discussed, but it is absolutely central to how it worked. Fear is the enemy of sleep. Everyone knows this. But the Romans had found a way to make fear itself into a weapon, not just for the barbarians on the other side of the rampart, but for the soldiers inside it. The fear of the fustuarium kept sentries awake. The fear of letting down your contubernium kept every man in the tent in a state of vigilance. The fear of the nightly inspection kept officers honest. And underneath all of that, the deeper fear, the one that every soldier on the Rhine or Danube frontier carried in his chest every night, the fear of what had happened to the legions in the Teutoburg forest. In 9 AD, 3 full Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were ambushed in the forests of Germania and utterly destroyed. 20,000 soldiers. Dead. Not defeated. Not routed. Annihilated. Their commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, fell on his own sword rather than be captured. The Emperor Augustus, on hearing the news, reportedly beat his head against the walls of his palace and cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions." Those legions were never reconstituted. The numbers, 17th, 18th, 19th, were never assigned to any new unit in Roman military history. The trauma was that deep, and every soldier on the frontier knew the story. Every soldier understood what it meant to be caught unprepared in barbarian territory. Not defeat, not capture, obliteration. That knowledge was, in a very real sense, part of the armor. Now let's talk about what happened when the alarm actually sounded. The signal was a horn. The cornu, a large, circular brass instrument whose sound could carry across an entire camp even in high wind. A single long blast meant general alert. Every man in the camp knew what to do. And here is where the months of training, the sleeping in armor, the identical camp layout, the memorized positions, here is where all of it paid off. A Roman soldier could go from horizontal to combat ready in under 30 seconds. Think about what that means. No fumbling for armor in the dark. It was either already on or loosened and ready to close. No searching for his weapon. It was in his hand. No confusion about where to go. The Via Praetoria, the rampart, his unit's designated defensive position, all of it was in his muscle memory. He moved not by thinking, but by doing. By the time a barbarian raiding party had breached the first line of defense, if they managed to breach it at all, past the ditch, the rampart, the palisade, and the sentries, they were not finding sleeping men. They were finding a wall of soldiers who had been half expecting them. This was the trap. The camp that looked like a target was actually a killing ground. The soldiers who looked like sleeping men were actually coiled springs. The night raid that had destroyed so many other armies bounced off the Roman system like a stone thrown at a granite wall. Here's a detail that brings this all into sharp focus. The archaeological evidence from Roman camps along the Antonine Wall in Scotland and the Rhine frontier in Germany shows something remarkable. The wear patterns on recovered armor pieces, the scratches, the stress marks on leather straps, the way metal fittings were worn down, are consistent not just with combat use, but with extended wear. The kind of wear you get not from putting armor on in the morning and taking it off in the evening, but from wearing it for prolonged periods, including, in many cases, through the night. We also have the manuals. Flavius Vigetius Renatus, writing in the late 4th century but drawing on earlier sources, is explicit about the importance of sleep readiness. His Epitoma Rei Militaris, the closest thing the Roman army had to an official training manual, describes in detail the expectation that soldiers in frontier zones should be capable of immediate response at any hour. He writes about the degradation of these standards in his own time, the late Empire, and frames it as one of the key reasons for Rome's growing vulnerability to barbarian incursion. He understood exactly what had been lost. The readiness was not just physical, it was cultural. It was a set of values, habits, and expectations that had been built into the Roman soldier over centuries. And when those values eroded, when comfort crept in, when standards slipped, when soldiers began to actually sleep in their sleep, the raids stopped bouncing off the wall. They started getting through. Let's look at the comparison, because this is where the Roman system truly stands apart. Take the Germanic tribes themselves. Fierce, brave, tactically adaptable, deeply knowledgeable about their own terrain. In a forest ambush, in broken ground, on their own terms, they were extraordinarily dangerous. But their camps? Their overnight defensive arrangements? Minimal by Roman standards. Tribal warriors on campaign often slept in loose groupings around fires, with limited or no systematic watch rotation, no standardized alarm system, no fortified perimeter. Their strength was in mobility and surprise, exactly the tactics the Roman system was designed to defeat. Even other sophisticated ancient armies struggled here. The Greek armies of the classical period, brilliant tacticians, disciplined hoplites, had nothing like the Roman overnight defensive system in terms of standardization and scale. Alexander the Great's army was capable of extraordinary things, but their marching camp protocols were significantly less rigorous than what the Roman legions of the imperial period would later develop. The Parthians, the Sassanid Persians, the armies of Carthage, all formidable, all capable of defeating Roman forces under the right circumstances. But none of them had systematized the night the way Rome did. None of them had looked at the hours between sunset and sunrise and said, "This is not rest time. This is just a different kind of war." There's one more layer to this story, one more piece of the system that rarely gets mentioned: the immunes. Within every Roman unit, certain soldiers were designated immunes, specialists who were exempt from general duties like construction and foraging because their skills were too valuable for ordinary work. Among them were the medici, the military doctors. Roman military medicine was, for its era, astonishingly sophisticated. Not because Roman doctors understood germ theory or had access to modern pharmaceuticals, but because the Roman military understood that a soldier who was sick, injured, or chronically sleep-deprived was a liability. They tracked injury rates. They tracked illness. They had dedicated hospital facilities, the valeted area, in permanent bases. They understood the connection between hygiene and health in a way that wouldn't be systematically applied in European armies again until the 19th century. And they understood the physical damage that sleeping in armor caused. The pressure sores. The muscle damage from restricted movement during sleep. The cumulative exhaustion. They did not eliminate these problems. They could not. The tactical necessity outweighed the physical cost. But they managed them. Routines for cleaning and treating pressure wounds. Rotations designed to give soldiers in the highest risk positions more recovery time when the threat level dropped. Specific rations, high in grain, supplemented with whatever local sources provided. Designed to maintain energy levels in men who were never fully resting. The system was brutal. It was also, by the standards of its age, carefully maintained. Let's slow down and really feel the weight of this. Not the weight of the armor, the weight of time. A Roman legionary served a minimum of 25 years. 25 years of this. 25 years of sleeping on hard ground in metal. 25 years of the watch rotation, of the password, of lying in a leather tent listening to a dark forest and trying to decide if that sound was the wind or something worse. 25 years of building camps and tearing them down. 25 years of being ready, every single night, to kill or be killed in the dark. What does that do to a person? We don't have the letters of ordinary Roman soldiers in great numbers, but we have some. Found at frontier outposts, preserved against all odds in the dry sand of Egypt or the cold bogs of northern Britain. They talk about the cold, about missing their families, about asking loved ones to send warm socks, specifically warm socks, mentioned by name, because the issue socks were inadequate, about the tedium, the long stretches of nothing punctuated by moments of absolute terror. One letter, found at Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, is from a soldier complaining about the Bertunculi, the Little Britons, and their habit of fighting from horseback and using javelins rather than engaging in proper close combat. He sounds, across 2,000 years, like every soldier who has ever complained about an enemy that refuses to fight on your terms. He sounds human. That is the thing that gets lost in discussions of the Roman military system. It was a machine, an extraordinary, terrifying, beautiful machine. But the parts of the machine were people. Young men mostly. Men who wanted warm socks and were afraid of the dark and missed their mothers, and had not signed up because they wanted to sleep in iron for 25 years. They did it because the system required it of them. And the system required it because the alternative was to die. Now let's talk about what happened when the system broke down. Because it did break down. And the moments it broke down are some of the most instructive in Roman military history. We already mentioned Teutoburg, but let's look more closely at what actually happened there. Varus was not a fool. He was an experienced administrator, a competent governor of the Rhine provinces. But he had been misled, systematically, over months, by a Germanic chieftain named Arminius who had served in the Roman army himself and understood the system from the inside. Arminius knew that the system only worked when it was operating, when the camp was built, when the watches were set, when the armor was on. He knew the system couldn't be beaten from the outside, so he waited for it to be off. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were not in a prepared marching camp when the ambush hit. They were strung out along a forest road, in column, in difficult terrain that prevented them from forming up quickly. Their defensive systems, the ditch, the rampart, the watch rotation, were all absent. They were, in a sense, naked, and Arminius destroyed them. The lesson Rome drew from Teutoburg was not that the Germanic tribes were unbeatable. The lesson was never let the system be off. Never be caught without the camp. Never march through terrain you haven't scouted. Never trust a friendly face too far. The lesson was that the system was not optional. It was survival. Jump forward to the 3rd century AD, the crisis of the Third Empire. 50 years of civil war, usurpers, military coups, plague, and economic collapse. In that period, The Roman military began to change in ways that would have horrified earlier commanders. Standards slipped. The grueling construction routines were abandoned or reduced. The marching camp, that daily miracle of organized labor, began to be skipped on some campaigns, with soldiers simply occupying existing structures or sleeping in the open. The watch systems became less rigorous. The training cycles shortened, and the barbarian raids got through. Not because the barbarians had suddenly become more dangerous, not because new weapons had emerged, but because the system that had neutralized the raid, the system of constant readiness, the sleeping in armor, the identical camps, the infallible watch, had been allowed to erode. Vigilius wrote his military manual during this period, or its aftermath. Watching the Roman army, he knew crumbling and desperately trying to document and preserve what had once made it great. He understood. He understood that the armor, the camps, the watches, they weren't just tactics. They were a philosophy, a way of existing in the world as a soldier. A set of habits so deeply ingrained that they functioned almost automatically, replacing individual judgment with collective instinct. And when that philosophy died, something irreplaceable died with it. Here's the full picture. Here's the answer to the question we started with. Why did Roman soldiers sleep in full armor to survive secret barbarian raids? Because they had built a system that turned the night, the most dangerous period for any army, into an equalizer. Because they understood that the barbarian raid was not primarily a military tactic. It was a psychological one. It was designed to catch you unprepared, to defeat you not with superior numbers or weapons, but with the primal terror of being attacked in your sleep. And the Roman army's answer was, we are never truly asleep. The armor that a soldier wore to bed was not just protection against a blade. It was a statement. It was a message sent inward as much as outward. You are a soldier. You are never off duty. You are never safe enough to stop being ready. The camp that was built fresh every day was not just an earthwork. It was a ritual, a daily renewal of the soldier's identity and his commitment to the system. We build this camp because we are Romans. We stand this watch because we are Romans. We sleep in this armor because we are Romans. The system worked not despite its extremity, but because of it. Because it demanded so much, physically, psychologically, day after year, that the soldiers who survived it were genuinely different from the men they had been before. They had been remade. And what they had been remade into was something the ancient world had never quite seen before and has never quite seen again. A soldier who was dangerous even in his sleep. There's a thought I want to leave you with. We look at the Roman legions, and we see discipline and engineering and military genius, and all of that is real. But underneath it, at the very foundation, is something much simpler. It's the choice, made by hundreds of thousands of young men over 1,000 years, to be uncomfortable, to sleep badly so that they could live, to carry weight so that others didn't have to carry grief, to lie awake in the dark, in 40 pounds of iron and leather, listening to a forest that might be about to try to kill them, and decide, again, to stay ready. Every night, for 25 years. And here's the question I want you to sit with. We live in a world that has largely outsourced its protection. Walls, locks, security systems, entire professional classes whose job is to be uncomfortable so that the rest of us don't have to be. If you had to personally guard what matters most to you, every night, no exceptions, no substitutes, how long before you built yourself a system? How long before you started sleeping in armor? Tell me in the comments. Because I genuinely want to know what you think you'd sacrifice to survive. And if this story made you want to understand what happened when Roman discipline finally, catastrophically, completely collapsed, when the last soldier put down his armor and never picked it up again, that's the next video. The fall of Roman military culture is one of the most haunting stories in human history. And it didn't happen the way you think.